Okay, so picture this, 11/09/1989. A wall made of concrete and barbed wire, a symbol of division that had split a city, a country, and really the entire world for 28 years. It just vanished overnight. But this wasn't some master plan. It wasn't a calculated political victory. It was, believe it or not, a colossal mistake. Today, we're going to unpack how a perfect storm of blunders, incredibly brave people, and one truly disastrous press conference accidentally brought down the Berlin Wall. You know, just 10 months before the wall fell, the leader of East Germany, Erich Honecker, made this incredibly defiant promise. For him and the ruling party, the wall wasn't just concrete. It was their guarantee of power forever. They had absolutely no doubt in their minds that it would stand. He was profoundly, spectacularly wrong. I mean, less than a year later, the very symbol of permanence he was talking about would be completely swarmed by cheering crowds and rendered totally meaningless in just a few hours. So how on earth did that happen? How did a promise of 100 more years just collapse overnight? Well, the answer lies in the absolute chaos of that one single night. A night that kicked off not with a plan, but with a rumor that spread like wildfire. After hearing these unbelievable reports on the news, thousands and thousands of East Berliners just poured into the streets, all heading for the checkpoints. And these weren't soldiers or activists. They were families, students, regular people, all driven by this one incredible rumor. The border was open, but the guards they were about to meet, they had absolutely no idea what was going on. So how does that even happen? You know, the wall didn't fall because of some grand design from Moscow or Washington, no. It fell by accident. It was a perfect storm of a system that was rotting from the inside out, the incredible courage of everyday citizens, and one final catastrophic blunder. To really understand why the wall was so fragile, we gotta rewind a little bit and look at the deep cracks that had been forming in its foundation for years. The GDR in 1989 was, to put it mildly, a state on the verge of total collapse. So behind that iron curtain, the East German state was just broadening. The economy was a complete disaster. Its industries were sluggish. The country was literally drowning in debt to the West. And get this, by 1989, economists were secretly telling the government it would be bankrupt by 1991. The entire state was just running on fumes. Now for decades, regimes like East Germany's had a kind of safety net, the Brezhnev Doctrine. This was basically the promise that if things ever got out of hand, you know, like they did in Hungary in '56 or Czechoslovakia in '68, Soviet tanks would just roll in and restore order. This doctrine was the ultimate glue holding the whole Eastern Bloc together. But in 1989, the new guy in Moscow, Mikhail Gorbachev, he just yanks that safety net away. And then, bam, the domino started to fall with stunning speed. In May, Hungary starts snipping its border fence. By September, that little crack becomes a gaping hole, and tens of thousands of East Germans are flooding to the west. The Great Escape was officially on. But here's the thing, not everyone fled. While thousands escaped through that hole in the Iron Curtain, hundreds of thousands stayed right at home to fight. And in doing so, they sparked one of the most courageous protest movements in modern history. Resistance began in these small, really dangerous ways. A pastor from Dresden, Martin Henke, remembers how church groups secretly published these little underground newspapers. This one was cleverly named We the Clueless. It was a bit of an inside joke, a jab at the fact that his city, Dresden, couldn't get Western and TV signals, so they were in the Valley of the Clueless. It was a tiny act of defiance that carried enormous risk, and these small acts, they started to snowball. Churches became these safe havens for organizing. And starting in September, peaceful Monday demonstrations began most famously in the city of Leipzig. They started small, but week after week, they just grew and grew, fueled by the mass exodus and the regime's total paralysis. And you have to understand, this was absolutely terrifying. As Pastor Henker recalls, the older protesters, they remembered 1953 when Soviet tanks mercilessly crushed Anuprising in East Berlin. They knew firsthand that this peaceful revolution could very easily end in a bloodbath, and it almost did. On October 6th, right before the state's big 40th anniversary party, the order came down. Armed force was authorized. The regime was basically preparing for its own Tiananmen Square, but then came the turning point. On Monday, October 9th in Leipzig, an incredible 70,000 people took to the streets. They were peaceful. They were carrying candles, and they were chanting, "We are the people." They faced down thousands of armed police and soldiers who are ready for a violent crackdown. And the security forces, totally overwhelmed and without clear orders, they just stood down. The regime had lost its will to fight. The people had won. So with violence now off the table and the country hemorrhaging its own citizens, the East German leadership just descended into pure panic. Their final desperate attempt to regain control would turn out to be their most spectacular failure yet. The whole system just fell apart in a matter of weeks. The old hardliner Honecker was out. His replacement went begging to Gorbachev for help and was basically told, "You're on your own." By November 7th, the entire government had quit. The power structure was just gone. So in this desperate bid to calm everybody down, the Politburo drafts a new travel law. The idea was to let off a little steam, but in a very, very slow bureaucratic way. You'd still have to apply for a visa and wait weeks. It was meant to be a tiny little pressure valve, not a demolition charge. But that little pressure valve was about to be fumbled in the most public way you could possibly imagine, all during a single disastrous press conference. Okay, so this is Günther Stabalski, the Politburo's new press guy. As he's walking into a totally routine press conference, someone shoves a memo into his hand with the new travel rules. Now he hadn't been in the meeting where they discussed it. He hadn't read the paper. He had absolutely no idea what he was about to announce. The plan was for this slow, controlled process. But when a journalist asks when the new rule would take effect, Schabowski just kind of shuffles his papers, looks totally confused, and then utters the words that changed the world, as far as I know, immediately without delay. He completely missed the fine print, the part that said it was al-embargoed until 4 a.m. the next morning. Whoops. The journalists in the room were just stunned. Within minutes, the first wire report hits. The Associated Press interprets Schabowski's rambling as the biggest story of the decade, and the first domino in the media cascade had just fallen. And then others followed. The German press agency confirmed it. The news spread like wildfire, and pretty soon, a mistaken media report was quickly becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. But the real accelerant, that was television. A West German news anchor went on air and just declared it to the world. Millions of East Germans watching on their TVs heard that the gates were wide open. Now, it wasn't true yet, but they all decided to go and see for themselves. What happened next was just this chaotic, joyous, and deeply human climax to decades of division, a moment powered entirely by ordinary people taking history into their own hands. The border guards were completely bewildered. I mean, their phones were ringing off the hook, but their superiors were nowhere to be found. All they could see were these massive crowds getting larger and more insistent by the minute, and all of them were saying they'd seen on TV that they were allowed to cross. At the Bornholm or Strasse checkpoint, the pressure just became unbearable. The officer in charge, Harald Jaeger, was fearing for his life and the lives of his men. He couldn't get a clear order from anyone, so at 11:30 p.m., on his own authority, he made a decision. He turned to his men and said, "We're opening the floodgates now," and he ordered the barrier raised. For East Berliners like Catherine Baumbach, a young translator, the entire world had just turned upside down. She and her friend went to a crossing a day later, still in a daze. And instead of guards with guns, they were met by West Berliners handing out gifts and cheering. It must have felt so surreal. They were given 100 West German marks as welcome money and just explored. They saw sights they'd only ever dreamed of. They tasted foods they'd never even heard of. I mean, just imagine that feeling. In her words, all of a sudden, the whole world was at our fingertips. So in the end, the Berlin Wall didn't fall because of some grand plan. It was brought down by this wild convergence of forces, a system that was rotting from the inside, the incredible bravery of its citizens, and a final, almost comical mistake by a panicked regime. History isn't always planned. Sometimes it just happens. The physical wall fell with shocking speed. But as many Germans will tell you, the invisible walls, those cultural and psychological divisions from 40 years of being separated, well, those have taken much, much longer to overcome. And it leaves us with a final thought. If a wall of concrete can vanish in an instant, why are the walls we build in our own minds so much harder to tear down?